at the beginning of the Edo period, had extensive relationships in Southeast Asia. It had trade with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Taiwan or Formosa. And so Japan was very interconnected across early modern East Asia at the beginning of the Edo period. And that changed, and I'll talk about that change a little bit today. But it's always important to remember that Japan is distinctive in lots of ways. It has a unique language, it has a very strong sense of its own culture and history, but it's also interconnected with its neighbors. And it had active relationships, active exchange of various kinds with its neighbors. One of the things that's unique about Japan, of course, is that it's located on the edge of the Pacific. So Japan, at the start of the Edo period, didn't have neighbors, in a sense, to the east. But at the end of the Edo period, it did have neighbors to the east, and that was America, right? The United States across the Pacific came to Japan and forced Japan to open to the outside world. So it is protected, in a sense, at the beginning of the Edo period by its location on the edge of the Pacific. And it also is protected by the fact that it is not so close to the Asian continent that it gets invaded regularly by its neighbors, but it is close enough to benefit from trade, from migration, and from regular exchange. Now, I need to go back in time a little bit to get us to the Edo period, explain the context. And I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail, but it's important for you to understand that before the Edo period, Japan was in a state of civil war. And this had gone on for about a century. The period of civil war is often called the Warring States period, because even though Japan was still essentially one culture, the different local rulers acted independently. They were referred to as warlords, and they would invade their neighbors or attack their enemies without asking anyone for permission. Um, Probably the most famous warlord of this era is the man you see on the screen. His name is Oda Nobunaga, and he began the process of reunifying Japan. He decided that he wanted to essentially conquer all of these warring states and pacify the country again to create political stability. He began that process somewhat successfully, but in the end, he was undone by one of his own vassals who betrayed him, and he died in 1582 before he had completed the process of unifying Japan. So the point here is to say that in the 16th century, before the Edo period, the samurai were really, truly at war. They were not just politicians, they were not just cultural patrons, they were warriors. Now, this is also an era when a lot of foreign visitors came to Japan. And probably the most famous and in some ways the most interesting for many of us are the Europeans who came to Japan in the late 16th century, recently made famous again on the FX Hulu miniseries drama Shogun. We know from that TV series and from the novel that it's based on and the real history that it's based on that there were many, many Portuguese merchants and Jesuit missionaries ministering in Japan in the late 16th century. And part of the reason they were successful is that the nation was at war. And there wasn't a single government who could say, yes, you are welcome, or no, you should leave. Instead, they were able to form alliances with local warlords and build churches, preach, learn Japanese customs, and trade. The most important goal for the merchants, of course, was trading Japanese ceramics, Japanese silks, Japanese weapons, and then also selling things from Europe to the Japanese. So all of this was happening during this era of civil war. So the next famous warlord who finally completed the process of reunifying Japan is named Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of the most important samurai in all of Japanese history. In the Shogun miniseries, by the way, he is the old man who dies at the very beginning, the Taiko-sama, he's called. Um, and he was an unusual candidate to reunify Japan. He came from humble origins. His father was probably a kind of peasant samurai. But he, through fierceness of will, through military strategy, through talent on the battlefield, but also through a drive to be a cultural leader, he rose through the ranks, fought under other generals, and then eventually became the ruler of all of Japan. Japan still had an emperor, and the imperial court existed in Kyoto, but it had become tradition by this time for the samurai ruler, the kind of real political ruler, not to eliminate the emperor, but to patronize, in both good and bad ways, the imperial court. And Hideyoshi continued those practices. Now, he was so successful at unifying Japan that he felt that the strength of the armies of Japan was so great that it could conquer any other nation. And he launched a war against Korea in 1592 that was unprovoked, called the Imjin War, with the goal of conquering China. No one really knows why he did this. There are lots of theories. And his own generals, many of them thought it was mad. But you couldn't say no to the man who had reunified Japan. And initially, the Japanese swept across the Korean peninsula quite successfully. They were pushed back by the armies of Ming Dynasty China, and a kind of stalemate resulted where the Japanese camped out in Korea for years. And it was only with the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598 that the Japanese withdrew their armies and actually sued for peace, essentially. They didn't exactly apologize, but they did reestablish diplomatic relations with Korea, as I said, returned many of the hostages that had been taken. Now, the damage in Korea, the damage to the armies of the Ming, was great. So this was a devastating and unnecessary war. Um, Countless civilian lives were lost in Korea. It's also the only time that Japan invaded its neighbors in the pre-modern era. I think there sometimes is a tendency to see the Japanese as warlike and aggressive in a global context because of what happened during World War II. But that was not really historically true before the modern era. And in the modern era, Japan would claim it was trying to protect itself. So this is the one instance of aggression. Now, after Hideyoshi died, the man who eventually became the most powerful warrior leader in the country is also the man who founded the government that we will be talking about today, Tokugawa Ieyasu. I love this painting of him because he looks a little frightened and a little concerned. And it's supposedly him on a stool after one very famous battle from his career. And it's a nice representation because Ieyasu survived for so long. He outlived all of his peers long enough to establish a new government, in part by being patient. He's very clever. Some say very manipulative, but I think the most important characteristic is that he was patient and he waited for his chance after the other more ambitious warrior leaders had tried and passed away. And so he, in 1600, fought at the head of an army against those who were opposed to Tokugawa rule. And this is a single battle over the course of a single day, but one of the most important wars in all of Japanese history, called the Battle of Sekigahara. And for various reasons, some of them luck, but some of them cultural, Ieyasu wrote a lot of letters to a lot of warlords before this battle and convinced them to fight on his side. And he won. His side was victorious. And as a result, he was in the position of being the unquestioned leader of the samurai in all of Japan. And in 1603, he won the right from the imperial court to start a new military government, which is called a shogunate in English. And he became shogun. The previous warlords who I mentioned were not shoguns. They were warlords. They didn't set up a court-approved government. But Ieyasu was able to do this. And the thing about these shogunal governments is that they are big institutions that have only happened before this 2 times in Japanese history, the Kamakura shogunate and the Muromachi shogunate. So this was the 3rd time a warrior government like this had been established. And from the very beginning, Ieyasu's main concern was stability. How do I guarantee that my rule will be followed by the rule of my son, and that his rule will be followed by the rule of his son, and that we will not be challenged by other warrior leaders who think they should be shogun? How do we both guarantee continuity in the family, but also preserve this stability that we have established? And a lot of what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 or 20 minutes is how the Tokugawa established stability after a century of civil war and after this huge international war, the Imjin War fought on the Korean Peninsula. Those wars, I didn't really go into the details, but they often involved more than 100,000 armed samurai troops. So there were a lot of dangerous men in Japan at this time. And so figuring out ways to keep everyone busy and happy and rewarded was an existential problem for Ieyasu. If he could not solve that problem, he was dead. And his men, his family, would be eliminated. So you can already see in the text on this slide one of the ways he did this. And it's so counter to, I think, what we would expect. He abdicated, he gave up the position of shogun after just 2 years. And he did this for a number of reasons. One is that there's a tradition in Japan of retiring but continuing to rule. So he knew that even after he abdicated, he could still have power. But the second reason is he wanted to normalize the idea that the role of shogun passes from father to son. And so he made his own son shogun in 1605, and Tokugawa Hidetada became the second shogun. By the way, he didn't ask. He rode into Kyoto with an army of 75,000 soldiers and informed the imperial court that he was abdicating and that his son should be appointed to be the next shogun. And nobody said no. So this was a military dictatorship. This was not a gentle, regime. But the goal was peace. The goal was stability. Now, Tokugawa Hidetada learned very well from his father how to be a ruler, and he himself abdicated in 1623 before his own death. Now, they did have one significant threat to their rule, and that was the family of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the warlord who had reunified Japan and launched the war against Korea. His son was still alive, and his son lived in the biggest and best defended castle in all of Japan, Osaka Castle. You can visit a reproduction of Osaka Castle today that looks quite realistic from the outside. On the inside, it's a modern museum, a lot of fun to visit. But this was an impregnable fortress. And so the Tokugawa in 1614 launched an attack on it, and they were unable to knock it down. They apologized, basically. But then, as they were withdrawing their troops, they sent workers out to fill in the moats and to weaken the walls around the castle. And months later, they were back. This time, they toppled the castle. The Toyotomi family was killed, and the Tokugawa had no further threats, at least not from other samurai. The third shogun, I promise I'm not going to go through all 15 shoguns, but these first few are quite important. The third shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu, is one of the most fascinating samurai in history, I think. He was born into a world of luxury. In 1602, when he was born, his father was already the most powerful samurai in Japan. And when he was 1 year old, his father became shogun, or his grandfather, I'm sorry, his grandfather became shogun. So he didn't ever have to fight on horseback. He didn't have to worry about his life in civil wars. He grew up a prince, essentially. And so if anyone might have been so weak, so not a battle-hardened samurai that he could have lost the authority of the Tokugawa name, it would have been him. He was sickly, he was tortured by dreams, and yet somehow he ended up being one of the strongest Tokugawa shoguns. Many of the policies that we associate with the Tokugawa state were his innovations. And I'll tell you now about a few of them. So one of the things he is most associated with is the final crackdown on Christianity and the ejection of most Europeans and other foreigners from Japan. So he essentially established a policy of very strong border control, which the Japanese felt was necessary, because they had experienced real threats as a result of new ideas coming into Japan from the outside world. In 1637, while Iemitsu was shogun, there was in fact a major rebellion in southern Japan that was a combination of Christian peasants who had been converted to Catholicism by those Jesuits who came in the late 16th century and had passed the tradition of Christianity down in their families, and Ronin, samurai who didn't have masters anymore, who had maybe been defeated in the Battle of Sekigahara, or who had been, servants of the lords who had been defeated at that time, who banded together in a castle in southern Japan and resisted Tokugawa rule. The Tokugawa put the rebellion down easily, but they realized this is a dangerous alliance. A foreign religion in which the claim is made that there is a God who you should listen to that is not the Buddhist gods or the Shinto gods, and a foreign religious ruler, the Pope, in Europe, who in theory can issue directives that Catholics should respond to. They felt represented a material threat. They also had good intelligence about the Spanish activities in the Philippines and in the New World, especially in New Spain or Mexico. And they knew that missionary activity and colonial activity were linked. So the decision to firmly control the borders of Japan that was finalized by Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun, was made as a very deliberate choice in light of global events and local events. It was not ignorant. It was not xenophobic, I would argue. It was about preserving stability and preserving the rule of the Tokugawa. Now, there were, sometimes this is called the closed country policy, or sakoku, which is a term that I think is inaccurate, because in fact, Japan was not completely closed. There were doorways. We should probably call it the doorway policy. One doorway was in northern Japan, where the Matsumai domain engaged in trade with the Ainu, the Ezojin, the people, the indigenous peoples who lived in Hokkaido. Another doorway was in Nagasaki, where the Dutch were allowed to maintain a very small colony on an island, and they were allowed to trade with Japan. The shogun, they would come all the way to Edo, and the shogun and his officials would interview them to gather intelligence about what was happening in the outside world. And they had very good information about what was going on in Europe and other parts of the world. Another doorway was the island of Tsushima, here between Korea and Japan, which was ruled by Japanese samurai families who also acted as middlemen in exchange of both trade and diplomacy with Korea. Lastly, the domain of Satsuma at the beginning of the Edo period invaded the Ryukyu kingdom, which we now know of as Okinawa, and they engaged in regular exchange and a kind of almost like a kind of colonialism with Ryukyu. So there were many doorways that were open during the Edo period. It's just that the government didn't allow Japanese people to leave. They didn't want someone from Japan to go to Vietnam or go to Macau, get Christian texts, get converted to Christianity, and come back to Japan. They would allow these limited points of contact where they could monitor and control and surveil, essentially. Another system that Tokugawa Iemitsu really finalized is called the system of alternate attendance. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of the Edo period. Under this system, the major warlords of Japan, so the feudal leaders of these huge domains, almost like states or provinces all across the Japanese archipelago, the leaders of those parcels of land were required to spend part of the year in Edo, essentially at court, and the other part of the year in their home domain ruling directly. This is essentially a hostage system because the families of those leaders lived in Edo all year long. And so if you, Donna, were the ruler of the Satsuma domain, you would come to Edo for part of the year and be with your family and be happy you were with your family and that you were in the big city. And then you would go back to Satsuma to rule for the other half of the year, and you were less likely to plot against the Tokugawa because your wife and children were there under the watchful eye of the Tokugawa. So it was a hostage system, but it evolved into an engine for the exchange of culture. Because every year, these powerful warlords and processions of hundreds of samurai would travel back and forth between Edo and these regional capitals, and they would bring material culture, visual culture, books, all kinds of interesting materials with them in either direction. And so the culture of the provinces would enter into Edo, and the culture of Edo would be transmitted out into the provinces. This is a period when, in many parts of the world, there isn't very much travel for fear of banditry, right? But in Japan, you have these safe highways that are built with rest stops all along the way that these processions can travel along. Don't get me wrong. Could a peasant just decide to pick up their bags and travel to Edo? Absolutely not. There were stations where papers were checked very assiduously. But culture and some people had the privilege and the freedom to move back and forth. So it had very different consequences than were, I think, intended. And it meant that Japan during the Edo period had a kind of cultural unity that is unusual in the early modern world. You don't find the same urban-rural gap or the same kind of center and periphery distinction that characterizes many other cultures at this time. Now, one thing that's really interesting about the Tokugawa state is that they were much more interested in the surface appearance of sort of stability than what was happening behind the scenes. And so one wonderful historian of Japan has called this performing the great peace, that the Edo period had a kind of stage play that everyone knew how to play their part. And in that play, the Tokugawa are supreme. But when the Tokugawa aren't looking, the local lords would say all kinds of terrible things about the Tokugawa, and they wouldn't follow policies, and they would do things the way they wanted to do them, and they had quite a lot of independence. And as long as everyone would march in order when asked, this was allowed. So the Tokugawa employed these two categories of sort of, I don't know, not diplomats exactly, but sort of bureaucrats who would go out and keep the system running. So inspectors would go and visit the different domains around Japan and verify that the local warlords were following the rules. And the most important rules were they weren't building new castles, because new castles could be threatening to the Tokugawa. And that, I think, was really, truly maintained. But other rules, like that they were recording everything accurately in records that were then submitted to the shogunate, didn't really matter that much. But at the same time, they had spies or metsuke who were sent out secretly, both within Edo and to the provinces, to try to ferret out any serious anti-government activity. And so, what's the result? The result is that the Tokugawa shogunate lasted until 1868, from 1603 to 1868. Now, this is an era, the social studies teachers and the history teachers on this call will already be thinking, this is an era of revolutions, civil wars, the beginnings of imperialism and colonialism, whole nations conquered. The rest of the world is not in good shape in many ways in this period, right? And Japan manages to avoid most of that chaos. Now, I probably sound like I'm super pro Tokugawa. And I just want to say that is not at all the case. I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a military dictatorship. People do not get to choose their jobs, they don't get to choose where they live, they don't have agency over necessarily who they marry or what kind of occupation they're going to pursue. They're containerized. If you're born a merchant, you become a merchant. If you're born a warrior, you live your life as a warrior. But from the point of view of the Tokugawa, whose goal was stability and continuity, it is a remarkable accomplishment in an era when other regimes were not as successful. Um, so that's the political context behind the rest of the lecture. There, of course, are changes that happen over time. There are individual shoguns who have really interesting personalities. There are eras when the shogunate is seen as a failure because there are famines or the economy, is doing incredibly badly. Prices are surging. So there's ups and downs. There are peasant rebellions when they feel like taxes are too high, usually concentrated in one region. But all of those challenges are overcome. This system maintains a kind of equilibrium. It corrects itself. And so I'm not going to go into the details of that chronology in the talk today. Instead, I want to turn now to the structure of Japanese society during the Edo period, because it's interesting and surprising in certain ways. So obviously, one of the main themes of my talk today is the samurai. And instead of putting up a painting of a samurai, I've decided to put up this mask. This is a battle mask. So this is a mask that you could attach to your helmet and wear riding into battle. You can see through it. You can yell through it. You can smell and hear through it. And in theory, it will help protect your face from an arrow or maybe even a clumsy swing of a sword or a spear. But I think the mask is a nice metaphor for the samurai in this period because they become something different than what they seem on the surface. They are layered and complex, especially in the Edo period. Now, one of the words that we hear a lot when we talk about the history and traditions of the samurai is bushido, which literally translates to the way of the warrior. And there are these 8 ideals, essentially, that are associated with the way of the warrior. And it's often said that this is the kind of code of living that guided the samurai throughout all of their history. And those terms are loyalty, devotion, obedience, duty, filial piety, respect, self-sacrifice, and honor to the death. One of the things that we know about the samurai is that if a samurai can't fulfill his honor, if he won't be victorious in battle, or if he is discovered to have committed some kind of crime, he might try to regain some honor by this gruesome practice of seppuku, right? Or sometimes the same term is pronounced harakiri, right? Cutting your belly, the ritual disembowelment. And if you watched the Shogun miniseries, it's kind of startling how many acts of seppuku there are in that series. And people often ask me, since I work on the exact same period that the Shogun miniseries is set in, how accurate is that? Were the samurai really running around cutting open their bellies right and left? And the answer, of course, is statistically, the samurai made up about 10% of the population. It was incredibly rare. It was not a regular practice. But in the heightened politics of that moment, when Japan was reunifying and then the Tokugawa were coming to power, there are many well documented instances of elite warriors committing seppuku for exactly these reasons of protecting their honor. So some of this Bushido code, I think, is helpful. But I'm a historian, so I also have to complicate the story a little bit. And to do that, I want to go back in history a little bit to one of the most famous instances in all of history of the samurai fighting to protect Japan. And that is in the 13th century, the late 13th century, when on two occasions the Mongol Empire, which of course spread across huge swaths of the world and conquered Korea, launched invasions of Japan. They were also fighting a war in China and eventually established, of course, the Yuan dynasty there. The samurai were called upon to fight off the Mongols, and they did so successfully twice. The fiercest army in the world, the Mongol Empire, could not conquer the Japanese samurai. Sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, that was because of the weather. It's not because of the weather. It's because the samurai fought them off sword to bow and arrow. But there was a huge problem, which is that when the samurai were done, when the Mongols were defeated, there was no treasure to dole out as a reward. There was no land to give to samurai who had fought efficaciously. There were no women and children from the conquered families. There were no villages that could be pillaged. That was what motivated samurai action, was material rewards. And that is, in fact, how samurai regimes, how shogunates maintained the peace, was by doling out huge territories of land to the most powerful warlords. And then every samurai who served those warlords would get an annual stipend, a salary, essentially. And the more important you were, the larger it was. So, what bothers me about the idea of the Bushido Code is that it was written to look like the code of chivalry by a Japanese Christian in the Meiji period, the modern era, when he wanted to convince white Americans and white Europeans that the samurai had been just as civilized as the knights of feudal Europe. He was the one who invented the code of Bushido, long after the samurai were gone. So it's a kind of messy history. Of course, the samurai did care about honor. That's why they sometimes committed seppuku. They also cared about money and they cared about rewards for them and their families. So I really don't think we should idealize the samurai too much. Now, in the Edo period, the samurai changed in really interesting ways because having successfully pacified Japan, having successfully established peace, having conquered their enemies, destroyed the Toyotomi family, set up the system of alternate attendants, set up the border control policy and the doorways to the outside world, there was no one to fight. The samurai class had no wars in which to demonstrate their supremacy, and they therefore became urban government bureaucrats. For the entire Edo period, most samurai of high status worked in government. They were the equivalent of bureaucrats who work in Washington, D.C., or in our state capitals. They were well educated. They were reasonably wealthy. They studied martial arts. They studied cultural practices. And every now and then they would hit each other with wooden swords. But they could not demonstrate their accomplishments on the battlefield. And this represented an enormous crisis of identity for the samurai as the ruling class of Japan. And we will see how that identity crisis was reflected in culture in a little while. Now, I've been talking almost exclusively this whole time about the samurai, but as I mentioned, the samurai only make up about 10% of the population of Japan in the Edo period. So we have to look at the other parts of the samurai, or of the social hierarchy, excuse me. So the group that is often considered to be in the second rung of society after the samurai, surprisingly, is agriculturalists, farmers, peasants. And that is because, according to the Confucian understanding of social value that Japan had inherited essentially from China, farmers matter because they're productive. They feed the nation. So they're essential. Now, does that mean they had rights? It does not. Does that mean they were well remunerated? Absolutely not. But ethically, at least in the realm of ideas, they occupied a privileged position and could go to sleep at night saying, I have contributed to the well-being of my community and of the domain or even of Japan. The third rung on the hierarchy was made up by another productive group, and that is artisans. This is weavers, potters, builders, those who, again, contribute tangible things to society and help to maintain the functioning of a city, a town, a government. Artisans, like samurai, live in cities. Peasants, farmers live in the countryside. Now, the fourth category is merchants. And merchants, in theory, were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And that's because there was a strong strain of anti-mercantile ideology in Confucianism. It was, for example, considered sort of unethical for a gentleman scholar to engage in commercial activity in idealized Confucian societies like China and Korea. So in theory, this idea was imported to Japan, but it was never really put into practice. The reality is that merchants were the most entrepreneurial and the most successful during the Edo period. And so one of the forms of tension that animates Japanese society in this era, makes it interesting and fun to study, is that with each generation, the merchants got richer and the samurai got poorer. And the reason for that is very simple. Samurai stipends were fixed. You received a set amount of money, essentially, every year based on your station. And you couldn't innovate to increase that, right? But merchants, year after year, like business people all over the world, were entrepreneurial. How can we make these wooden clogs out of less wood and sell them for the same price, right? How can we improve our banking activities and lend at higher rates? How can we improve sake production and make more money with each jug of sake sold, right? And so the economy responding to all of those commercial activities, experienced inflation. Prices went up over time. Merchant revenues went up over time. Their wealth went up over time. But samurai stipends were fixed. So, in relative terms, samurai were growing poorer and poorer and poorer over the course of the Edo period. So, what did they do? The same thing, unfortunately, that happens in our society. They took out loans. And who did they take out loans from? The merchants. So, we have all kinds of evidence of this. You can find wonderful letters written by mid to low level samurai writing to these merchants who are their social inferiors, but to whom they now owe enormous sums of money. And it's shameful, it's unethical. And often it's the samurai's own fault. They're spending too much money doing things they shouldn't do, going to the red light district, eating extravagantly, drinking huge quantities of alcohol. Um, they're having an identity crisis after all, right? So it's really a fascinating part of the period that the lowest group is, in fact, economically the most powerful. Now, don't get me wrong, the shogun, the warlords who rule the domains, they're the super rich, and that doesn't change. But some merchants acquire enough wealth to be almost able to rival them, at least in the realm of economic, like buying power, purchasing power. Now, they weren't allowed to show it. The samurai had to wear fancy clothes out into public, and merchants had to be a little bit more demure. But inside their homes, they had lavish collections of textiles, beautiful artworks they had commissioned. Um, and and they were getting richer. So, how did the samurai respond culturally? Um, one way is that there was a real celebration in the Edo period of what I would like to call martial culture, cultural practices that are reminiscent of war, but do not involve killing people. So, one example is falconry. Falconry, of course, is a practice, a form of hunting practiced all over the world, often associated with kingship, with the sovereign right to rule. And in early Japan, was dominated by the imperial court when the imperial court really ruled. But once the imperial court became a kind of figurehead, falconry was taken over by the samurai class. And the shoguns of the Tokugawa era, many of them loved falconry. And they set aside huge preserves of land, massive, um, plots of forests, of hills, of fields that were reserved only for their falconry and hunting activities. And this, of course, infuriated the local peasants who wanted to use that land, but they weren't allowed to on punishment of death. Not all Tokugawa shoguns loved falconry. Not all samurai loved falconry. Some became city boys, basically. They preferred their creature comforts in Edo. But for those who continued to go out in the fields and to know how to travel through the land, falconry remained a very popular practice among the samurai. Another practice that really appeared in new forms in the Edo period was the display of swords. Now, in the era of civil war, in the Sengoku period, swords were primarily used on the battlefield for hand-to-hand combat or for cutting the head off your enemy so that you could prove who you had defeated. It's very grisly, but head hunting was an important part of samurai warfare in the Sengoku or Warring States era. But there's no headhunting happening during the Edo period. It's so boring. So instead, you display your swords on racks in a banqueting hall or a visitation hall when you invite other samurai over to visit. You're showing off the heritage of your family and you're telling stories, noble stories about your ancestors and their accomplishments now that you can no longer prove your honor on the field of battle yourself. So samurai would have other samurai over for a banquet, have swords displayed in the room, and say, "Ah, yes, my great grandfather used this sword at the Battle of Sekigahara." And that's why we're here in this castle today. Um, and one of the really interesting kind of knock-on effects of this culture of display is that swords were often displayed with the scabbard and the blade separated. As you can see here, the blade is on the bottom and the hilt has been detached. The hilt and the guard have been detached. And so what I find fascinating about this is it reduces the sword to an art object, right? The sword becomes a work of craftsmanship. It's no longer really a weapon. It's to be admired visually and aesthetically. Now, I will say there is some evidence that on occasion, certain high ranking warriors who had important heirloom swords would petition the government for special permission to engage in what were called practice cuts, in which human bodies of recently executed criminals were made available to warriors who wanted to practice cutting to make sure the blade still worked as intended. And sometimes that would actually be marked on the blade, how many practice cuts the blade had successfully accomplished. It's a little gross, if you ask me, but it was a dilemma. It was part of the identity crisis of the samurai in this period. Armor is another example. The armor of the samurai is one of the great contributions of Japanese culture to the world. This is the most interesting, frightening, impressive armor anywhere, in my opinion. The horns, the hair, the mask, the helmets, it's awesome. And these were suits of armor that were actually worn into battle in the late 16th century. But by the Edo period, there are no more wars to fight. These instead become objects of heritage displayed in the home that you can use to tell the story of your family. They become museum pieces in a sense. All right, so continuing on now, let's look a little bit at one of the really important trends of the Edo period that defines the culture of Japan in some ways, and that is urbanization. Now, the political capital of Japan in this age is Edo. And it's the capital because it was the headquarters of Tokugawa Ieyasu after 1590. He was assigned to this eastern region of Japan, the Kanto Plain, by Hideyoshi, and he chose to make his headquarters in what was really a small castle town. It didn't have a big population. It didn't have a lot of merchants or artisans, but it was on a plain next to a bay, and there were a number of rivers. And he said this would be a good place to establish my home base. No idea at this point that he would ever be establishing a shogunate here, right? 100 years later, Edo has become the largest city in Japan. And in fact, we think the largest city in the world at that time. At the center is Edo Castle, which has grown to be this enormous palace complex. Around it is a massive moat, and then all of the residences of the great warlords, which is surrounded in turn by another moat or system of canals. And then you have all these different urban districts that develop. Then eventually you go out far enough, and all the warlords build their second palace, where they have their huge strolling gardens, which I'll show you in a minute. Edo becomes not just a city, but what urban historians call a mega city. Or I've sometimes seen the term what is it? Megalopolis, a kind of cosmopolitan urban center, the likes of which had never been seen before. And that meant that these warriors had to become urban planners and urban administrators. And we have all kinds of really interesting research on how the city of Edo was run. Imagine, for example, the danger of fires. Practically everything in the city of Edo is built out of paper or wood. So you have to have local fire brigades in every neighborhood. Water supplies have to be regular and clean. Human waste has to be removed from the city and brought out to agricultural regions where it is used as fertilizer. Food has to be ported in, trash has to be ported out. It's a huge uh, urban planning problem that the Tokugawa and their vassals managed. And they managed it so successfully that Japan as a whole became one of the most urbanized societies in the world at that time, as it continues to be today, by the way. So by 1700, 5 to 6% of the population lived in cities, not just Edo, but Edo or other cities. By 1800, that had doubled to 10%. And the population of Edo reached around 1 million people. The population of Osaka was around 380,000, and the population of Kyoto was around 340,000. So this was, in many ways, surprisingly, an economically vital society that was interconnected and had regular flow of goods and people. And it was a highly urbanized society. All of this without engaging in regular trade with the outside world at a massive level, at least. Now, Edo became not just a city of samurai, but also a city of merchants and artisans. Many, many, many artisans and merchants moved there, of course, initially to serve these warlords who were spending half of the year in the Tokugawa capital. Palaces had to be built, huge residences, storehouses. I'll show you a picture of a warlord compound in a moment. But it was a tremendous amount of work. And then they stayed because the economic opportunities continued to grow. Over time, uh, other kinds of urban commoners moved in as well, as as well as um, people who might be considered undesirable in many societies, beggars, prostitutes, and even these groups found a home in Edo. There were red light districts that were officially sanctioned by the shogunate, and there were guilds of beggars so that if begging had to happen, it would at least be orderly, very much in line with other Tokugawa policies. Now, some merchants really began to thrive in this period. And what I have here on the screen on the left is a woodblock print from the Edo period showing the shop known as Echigoya. And on this sign, I know it's very small, but you can actually see it's written Echigoya Honten, or the kind of head shop, the headquarters of the Echigoya. This was a department store, essentially. And although it's a little hard to make out to us today, what are shown on the walls and floors of these two rooms are goods that the Mitsui are selling. And what's really interesting is they have price tags. So one of the things that Echigoya did to innovate is they actually said what the price was. So instead of having to haggle, which is what you had to do in most shops, you could just walk in and see if you could afford something or not. The Echigoya grew enormously. It was an incredibly successful mercantile commercial activity, and it survives today. I mean, not the exact same spot as the Mitsukoshi department store, a huge successful department store in Japan. And there were many merchant families like the Mitsui who innovated in these entrepreneurial ways. So the city became a tense balance between the samurai and their military dictatorship and this kind of fertile commercial activity, this bottom up street culture of prostitutes, beggars, merchants, artisans, all the non samurai who lived in the city. And like many cities, it was characterized by huge gaps between the rich and the poor, between the haves and the have nots. But that also, as it does in the world we live in, enlivened those urban centers. I want to talk a little bit about the warrior estates in Edo. So when the ruler of a whole province, a feudal lord who was required to spend half the year in Edo, came into the city. He wanted to be comfortable. He wanted to live in luxury. And he also wanted creature comforts that reminded him of his home domain. And so these warrior estates were ruled and run almost like embassies. You know how in the modern diplomatic system, the territory of an embassy is technically the territory of that foreign power? These daimyo estates, these warrior estate or warlord estates acted in the same way. So that when you go into the warrior compound of the Satsuma domain, you'll encounter music from Satsuma, food from Satsuma. You would hear the Satsuma dialect being spoken, and they're policed, and the entry and exit is heavily guarded. So you can't just wander in and out of these warlord estates. They have tall, formidable walls. And if you live your life inside of the Satsuma compound, it's like growing up in Satsuma. They also became sites for acts of cultural patronage and various types of artistic pursuits. So this is a sample of one of the gardens from one of these warlord estates, known as Korakuen Garden. Now the garden has changed over time, but gardens are one of the arts that really flourished in the Edo period, in part because of this exchange between the provinces and the city, right? So these warlords wanted to build gardens with flora from their home territory in Edo. So you have horticultural exchange, botanical transfers happening between the far-flung regions of Japan and the city of Edo. In these gardens, you will have, as we see here, large ponds that in some cases are meant to represent oceans or to represent scenes from Buddhist cosmology. The lotus, of course, is a very important plant in the Buddhist tradition with sacred meaning. Um, Warriors would stroll throughout the garden on a daily basis. And so the garden is designed so that at different points in the garden, you have completely different scenery. And this is true if you get a chance to visit a traditional Japanese garden today. At the entry point, you might see the pond and a hill. But then when you go on the other side of the pond, you see trees that frame the pond in a completely different way. So it's almost like the scenery is being reinvented as you stroll throughout the garden, framing each angle and each view with new aesthetic value. Um, there also is a principle in Japanese garden design called shakke, or borrowed scenery, which is where trees or mountains that are outside of the garden are very carefully incorporated into the design so that they become part of the visual and aesthetic pleasure of walking through the garden. Here's another image of a different part of the same garden of Korakuen Garden. So you can see it's a completely different view, although it's the same pond with a stone walkway through the edge of the pond. That would be part of the daily stroll that the daimyo and his vassals might go on as he takes in the scenery. So even though you're living in the largest city in the world, you still, if you're an elite warlord at least, have the chance to walk through these beautiful gardens. And this becomes part of the garden heritage of Japan. Even today, Japanese gardens are considered some of the most um, beautiful and carefully designed. Now, one thing I want to note, though, about Japanese gardens is they are not at all natural. And what I mean by that is that every plant is carefully trimmed and pruned. And the idea of wild nature that the American national parks, for example, seek to preserve is not considered the goal in a Japanese garden. Instead, like a bonsai tree, pruning and controlling nature to achieve specific scenes, specific meanings, specific aesthetics is the goal. So it's a very different attitude, I think, towards gardening. And people sometimes go to a Japanese garden, they say, oh, the natural beauty is so amazing. And I sort of understand what they mean. The plants are beautiful, the pond is beautiful, but these are really works of art. And nature is playing a role, but they're quite artificial. And I mean that in a good way. I don't mean that as a criticism. So speaking of gardens leads me quite natural to another one of the major topics for today, which is tea culture or chanoyu, also sometimes called chado or sado, the way of tea. Now, we all know how popular tea is all over the world today. It's one of the most consumed beverages in the world. You might have loose leaf green tea. You might have oolong tea from China. These days, a lot of my students, all they can think about is boba tea, right? Tea that has the gelatinous boba balls, made popular in Taiwan and Southeast Asia, but now found all over the world. Um, the tea of Chanoyu is something different. It is made of powdered green tea or matcha, no sugar, no dairy, just hot water and powdered green tea that has been whipped into a froth with a whisk. It's very strong, it's very caffeinated. I think it's very delicious, but it's a taste you have to get used to. And this became popular in the medieval period in Japan, and warriors started drinking bowls of tea out of Chinese ceramics as a sign of how civilized they were. They would collect Chinese art and hold these tea drinking sessions in beautiful rooms in their palaces. Over time, this evolved into a ceremony, often led by what's called a tea master. A merchant, a warrior, a Buddhist priest could all study tea, master the choreographed moods of preparing and serving the tea, and then lead a tea gathering as the host. Now, on the screen, you see a picture of a chashitsu, or a tea room. And here on the left is where the host would sit to prepare the tea using all the utensils here. And here in the middle of the room, we see what's called a tokonoma, this word here, a decorative alcove. And the tokonoma is used to display a hanging scroll that often has a poem or a painting on it, and a flower arrangement, a chabana, which usually signals the season. And so a tea gathering is such a special experience. I hope everyone on this call someday in your life can experience a tea gathering, although you also can see tea gatherings online. You can visit tea rooms at gardens, Japanese gardens all over the country, all over the world. But in a tea gathering, you enter silently into the room. The host welcomes you and then prepares the tea slowly, very deliberately, and you watch the host prepare the tea. Then they serve a bowl of tea to each guest. You drink the tea, you thank the host. You might have a sweet before you. My computer just about fell. You might have a sweet. I got so excited about the sweet. You might have a sweet before the tea. You might have a whole meal after the tea. But the essence is just that drinking of the tea bowl. And then you admire the art. You admire the bowl. You admire all the utensils that were used to prepare the tea. You admire the hanging scroll and the flower arrangement. It's very soft and quiet and meditative. It always brings in the natural world through that flower arrangement and through that hanging scroll. So there's a sense of poetry, a sense of seasonality. And the samurai loved the tea ceremony, were huge patrons of the tea ceremony. They all had tea masters who were hired permanently to serve them in their castles and their palaces. Lower level samurai would often study tea. And there are many, many, many writings from later in the Edo period by samurai rulers saying to younger samurai, you have to stop spending so much money on tea utensils You have to stop devoting all of your time to the practice of tea. We need to rule more frugally. We're in debt to these merchants, and it's all because you're spending too much on Chan Yu. So the samurai became such devoted patrons of this practice that some of them ruined themselves. And again, this is part of the identity crisis of the samurai population in the Tokugawa period. Now, tea culture is associated with Buddhism. Back in China, where tea practice in a different form originated, tea was often drunk in Buddhist monasteries by monks who were going to meditate. And of course, tea is caffeinated and it's a stimulant, so it helps you to stay awake if you're spending long hours meditating and very few hours sleeping, especially in the Chan or Zen tradition of meditation. Drinking tea was considered a basic way of taking care of your body so that you could meditate more effectively. And partially through its connection to meditation and to Buddhism, it came to have these ideals associated with it. There was a great tea master who served Hideyoshi, Sen no Rikyu, who is famous for teaching these ideals, although they have become a basic part of the tea ceremony. Harmony, this refers to the fact that in a tea garden, in a tea room, in the tea utensils, you can have interesting arrangements of objects, but you don't want to have something that stands out and clashes with everything else. You want to have equilibrium and harmony among all of the people and objects present. Respect. In a tea ceremony, you always are thanking the host. You use polite language. You're bowing. You should not be aggressive or mean in the tea room, no matter how elite of a samurai you are. Purity. Every utensil is wiped and washed and treated respectfully, but also is kept very clean. And then tranquility. You don't have a loud shamisen concert in the middle of a tea gathering. It's about hearing the natural sounds of the garden outside, the bubbling of the water in the kettle, and that's all. It's very, very calm. This is an image of matcha being mixed in a black raku tea bowl, a classic kind of tea bowl for the tea ceremony, by a bamboo whisk. And as you can see, this is not coffee. This is not loose leaf tea. It's a different kind of beverage. It's really special. I really hope you will seek it out. Now, an important part of tea culture are the utensils that warlords and merchants alike loved to collect. And one of the reasons art collecting became such a standardized practice in Japan long before the modern period is that tea practitioners wanted to collect utensils for their tea gatherings. One of the most prized kind of tea utensils was a karamono, which means a Chinese thing, an imported antique from China. Chinese ceramics, Chinese lacquerware, Chinese metalwork were all highly prized. And unfortunately, most people could not afford to acquire Chinese things. Only the highest ranking warlords. This tea caddy, for example, was in the collection of Tokugawa Ieyasu and passed down in the Tokugawa line. And there are so many incredibly famous Chinese ceramics that only exist in Japan because they were preserved so carefully there by tea practitioners. But another kind of artwork that was much beloved in tea circles was the wamono, or the Japanese thing. And these developed in contrast in many ways to Chinese objects to be very natural looking, to celebrate aesthetics like asymmetry, rusticity, naturalness. So, for example, the jar that we see on the screen, which would be used to hold loose leaf tea for storage, is made in the Shigaraki kilns, found to the east, pretty far to the east of Kyoto. And they're fired in these huge kilns where ash is allowed to settle on the ceramics and create this natural glaze that drips down in interesting patterns. And the clay, which is dug from under the rice fields, cracks in really complex natural patterns. And these are not seen as flaws. They're seen as beautiful points of interest that the tea collector obsesses over and loves, and even talks about in his tea diaries that he keeps of every tea gathering he goes to. So there's infinite interest and beauty, I think, in tea culture. And I highly recommend that you seek out some of the teaching materials that a team based at UCLA that I was lucky to be a part of prepared as part of the Japan Past and Present Project. This is a massive project that is actually funded by the founder of Uniqlo. It's called the Yanai Initiative. And teaching tea is one of the projects that many of us got to be involved in. And it includes images, essays, terminology lists. There are some videos, there's some lesson plans. Really, I think an incredible resource, freely available for all to use. But if you could ever find a way to create a little lesson in any class that you teach in which students had to think carefully about the objects that they were bringing together um, in what in Japanese is called a toriawase, that would be a really wonderful learning experience, I think. And I'm pretty sure Crystal has put the link in the chat as well.
Yes.
All right. Thank
I will
you.
also include it in the follow-up email. So
Awesome. Thank you, Crystal.
great.
So moving on, not too much more here, just a few more slides to cover. We're going to have lots of time for questions. I can see a whole bunch of comments and questions in the chat that I'm really excited to get to. Of course, another very important part of Edo period culture was the performing arts. And one of the most famous performing arts is kabuki theater. Kabuki theater is a form of street theater. It's bottom-up culture. This is not the culture of the elites. This is culture that literally originated along the banks of the Kamogawa in Kyoto, the river that runs through Kyoto. Initially, it was performed by women prostitutes. They were banned, so then it was performed by boy prostitutes. They were banned, so eventually it was performed by men. And over time, it became strictly a male form of theater. All the actors playing male and female roles are men. And there are many different kinds of plays performed in kabuki, but one of the main genres is the historical play, or the jidaimono. And these plays often tell the stories of the samurai, both stories of great samurai victories, but also stories of tragic samurai defeats. One of the most famous is the story of the 47 Ronin, which is a real historical event that happened where a warlord was forced to take his own life for committing an offense in Edo Castle. And his vassals, the men who followed him, vowed to seek revenge, but they had to go underground for several years before they could get their vengeance. That is a famous puppet theater play and kabuki play. There are many other examples. But what I think is fascinating is I read these stories about the samurai in kabuki theater as one of the ways that the crisis of the identity of the samurai was, if not resolved, at least made sense of, both by the samurai who did attend these plays and by the commoners who were the most frequent attendees. And I think it's because the merchants were also aware that their society was broken, that they were richer than the men who owed them debt, who were ostensibly their betters. And going and seeing these stories of samurai triumph and tragedy helped them to make sense of living in a society that was ruled by warriors who no longer fought wars. It kind of provides a sort of rationale. In the past, these were the samurai, and that's why they rule today. This is me speculating, of course. We don't have diaries where anyone says, this is why I like samurai kabuki plays. But I think this is one possible reason for their popularity. There's another theatrical form called the No theater, which is much older, goes all the way back to the medieval period, and is a top-down theatrical form. It was patronized primarily by samurai rulers. And these plays are much more nostalgic, much more about the great battles of the past and the lost legacy of the samurai. Many plays, like the famous play Atsumori, and the image we see on the screen is of an actor, a no actor playing the role of Atsumori, celebrate the famous battles in Japanese history in the past. Again, the battles that now have become only history in the Tokugawa period, in the Edo period. No battles to be fought. So these famous battles become almost like literary objects. They're part of the imagined past of the samurai. And sometimes the samurai die glorious deaths, and sometimes they die miserable deaths in the no plays. But again, they allow a place for this nostalgic remembering. Many no plays revolve around a dream or an encounter with a spirit. And it seems very obvious to me that that spirit is the spirit of samurai in the past, who did fight on the battlefield, who were real warriors, visiting their urbanized, pacified city boy brethren during the Edo period present. So that brings me to the end of the samurai. And of course, in 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown, and it was replaced by an imperial government that eventually modeled itself on Western monarchies. So that the man on the left, the young boy Emperor Meiji, became the man on the right, the modern imperial monarch, dressed in a Western military garb, right? But one thing you need to know about the Meiji Restoration is it was not a rebellion against the samurai. Many of the leaders of the Restoration were, in fact, samurai uh, uh, rulers or uh, from the samurai class. It was instead a rebellion against the Tokugawa, the family that had made the shogunate their sole privilege, right? And it was because the Tokugawa were unable to keep out the West, were unable to keep out the Americans who came in the 1850s and forced Japan to sign treaties, to open up ports to trade and commerce, and to protect Japan from outside intrusion the way the Tokugawa had been doing since the 1640s. So once they failed at that task, there are many other sins, the many other pressure points, the many other tensions, all combined to make their rule untenable. And I have to say, it wasn't much of a civil war compared to the American Civil War, compared to other civil wars of this era. The loss of life was not that terrible. And the samurai initially were not even really overthrown per se. Instead, the samurai, in theory, now served the Meiji emperor. Only gradually, as the Japanese oligarchs who ruled this new Meiji government came to understand that you couldn't pay all the samurai huge salaries just for being samurai in a modern economy, was the samurai class gradually abolished and dismantled. This was a slow process. I can talk more about how that process worked if people are interested. There was one pushback, and that's the Satsuma Rebellion, famously represented in the movie The Last Samurai. That was a real historical event, although the Tom Cruise character is a Hollywood, fictionalization, of course. But that was the kind of last gasp of the samurai. And after that, the samurai became objects of memory, objects of history, and they were, revived from time to time in representation, in culture, um, and have become a source of fascination all over the world. But they really started to come to an end with the Meiji Restoration of 1868.